Today, we're talking about your most recent book. It's Jack in the Box, a piece of work that's very personal to you. And tell us, what was the impetus for this excellent piece of work?
Yeah, well, thank you, first of all, Joe. This has been one that's been brewing in the back of my mind for a long time, and I mean, I'll tell the story or parts of it anyway in the next few minutes. But I guess it whenever I have taken player or friends rather to the Leaf games, we sit and I quite often will point out that there's a picture of Jack McLean scoring a goal against the New York Rangers, and oh, that's cool. Who's that? And at the time, I thought he was an uncle, but it turns out it wasn't. But it's one of the stories, and I wear his ring, and I'm kind of blowing the story a little bit here. I'm giving away the punchline, but I wear his Stanley Cup ring, and people are all enthralled to see that as well. So people have always said, "Oh my God, Kevin, that's an amazing story. You got to write a book." And yeah, maybe one day, maybe one day. And it just, I had other projects on the go, and finally I thought, you know what? If I don't do it now, I may never get to it. And so I decided to accumulate all of the research that I had done, the conversations I had with Jack through the years, the information that I had received from other players and friends and things like that, and put it into the book that we now have, which is Jack in the Box. And so that's where it came from, and very proud to have it out now.
Yeah, it's crazy, incredible story. Well, let's start at the beginning. So, you're take us through the process. So, your father passed away a few years ago. You're going through his things, after the funeral. Take it from there.
Yeah, thanks. So my dad died, he had a cancer diagnosis and died 3 weeks later, and stunned us all. And that was 1991, early part of the year in 1991. So as all dutiful children and siblings and whatever do, they have to go through his things and get rid of them. So we had boxes for Goodwill and boxes for garbage. But one of the things that I came across, which was really interesting, was a box. Really interesting little box. He'd clearly made it when he was in probably grade 8 or something like that. You could tell that it was homemade. He'd stamped his initials HS on the bottom. The nails weren't perfect. The wood didn't fit exactly perfect, but it was actually darn good. And the fact that it was my father's was the main thing. So it had a lock on it, and I didn't want to break the box because it's special to me. It was my dad's, and my mom said, "Just pry the hinges off the back. Go ahead, no harm." I said, "No, I don't want to do that." And I finally, the curiosity got the best of me, and in fact, I did exactly that. And when I opened it up, not knowing what I was going to find, I found all kinds of newspaper clippings and mostly pictures. And they were of Toronto Maple Leaf players. He had clearly collected them through the years from the Toronto Daily Star or the Toronto Telegram or whatever newspaper he happened to be able to get at that time. And I noticed some of the big names that we know, and the Ted Kennedys and the Sil Apses and different players like that. But there was an awful lot of pictures of a guy named Jack McLean, and I wondered why. Because I'm pretty good with hockey history, and the Leafs are my specialty, but that's a name I didn't know. And there he is in the front right there, raising his stick after scoring a goal on the New York Rangers. And there he is looking great. His elbow pads outside of his jersey, which was the way it was back then. And there he is smiling broadly. He was very proud to be a Toronto Maple Leaf. And there he is on the official program from probably 1944 or 1945. So I found this picture, and because I idolized my dad, I mean, my dad had infused in me a passion for hockey and for the Toronto Maple Leafs. I wanted to find out why this player was my dad's favorite player. So I did an awful lot of research, went to the Toronto Public Library and researched like crazy, discovered that Jack McLean had only played for 3 seasons, 1942-43 until 1944-45, just during the Second World War, and found out what kind of a player he was. He had a funny skating style, rather. He kind of ran on his skates, but he was very, very fast. In fact, they had a skills competition in 1943, and he won the fastest skater competition for the Leafs, and so that was fun. But I found out that he was going to university at the same time. He was taking an engineering degree. So because of that, and because the war was going on, He was never allowed to practice with the team. He showed up for games and played. He wasn't allowed to cross the border. University students weren't allowed to cross the border. So in effect, he only played home games and the odd Montreal game in Montreal. And that's the way he conducted his career. He wasn't the only one, but he was one of two or three who were doing exactly that. So it was a very odd time. The Second World War with the NHL was really kind of an odd time. A lot of the boys had gone on to serve their country. And guys like Jack McLean, who were 19, 20-year-old university students, were filling the roster. So I found out a great deal about him. His very first game with the Maple Leafs, he collected 3 points, a goal and 2 assists to beginning. And later on through his career, he was in 1943 during the playoffs. He was the youngest Leaf player to score a playoff overtime goal. That record still exists to this day. And he also scored the second longest goal, or I guess scored the winning goal, I guess I should say, in the second longest game in Maple Leaf history. And that was in the 4th overtime in 1943 against the Detroit Red Wings. So he's got his name in the record books a little bit, but really it was a very short 3-year career. And by the age of 22, his NHL career was over. So my passion and obsession, I guess I would say, continued on. I had to find out whether this man was alive or dead and where he lived, and just wanted to find out more about this Jack McLean. So I finally wrote letters to all of the major newspapers across Canada and said, listen, if you know anything about Jack McLean, please call Kevin Shea, and I put my phone number in it. Well, the Toronto Sun newspaper published it, and the phone rang off the hook from, I'm guessing, 7 o'clock in the morning till I unplugged the phone at about 7 o'clock that night. And I talked to, former teammates, scouts who had seen him play, his first girlfriend, former neighbors, all kinds of people, some names that we would know. Jerry McNamara, who went on to be a general manager with the Maple Leafs. He called me from the golf course and said, I remember listening to the radio and hearing Jack McLean play. But nobody seemed to know where Jack was, and if he was alive, where he was living. Nobody. I talked to Bob Davidson, who was the captain of that team, Ted Kennedy, who was a teammate. Nobody knew, and everyone said the same thing. Oh, terrific guy. Geez, if you see him, say hi for me, okay? He was a great guy, but nobody seemed to know. So I put all the clues together and realized that if he was alive, he was living in Ottawa. And I thought, okay, I was reticent. There must have been a reason why he hadn't been talked to or hadn't been found in so many years. So I called every one of the J. McLean's, Jack McLean's, John McLean's in the Ottawa phone book, and I finally got one. I said, hi, is this Jack McLean who played with the Maple Leafs? And a gruff voice on the other end of the phone, Joe, said, who wants to know? Well, my name is Kevin Shea. I'm a hockey historian, and I just wanted to see if I could ask you a couple questions. Years ago, I probably can't answer it. My memory's not so great these days. And I said, well, and I mentioned about winning the skills competition. He said, oh my God, I hadn't thought of that in years. I won a watch. It was a piece of crap. And I was, oh, geez, okay, Jack. So I could tell that he was coming to the end of his rope at that point. He didn't want to talk anymore. It was probably 20 minutes in. And then he said something quite astounding. He said, what's your name again? I said, it's Kevin Shea. He said, I used to know some Shays. I said, oh, yeah, that's not an uncommon name, but it's not a particularly common name either. And I said, oh, yeah, who'd you know? He said, well, yeah, Howard Shea. And it stopped me in my tracks. Howard Shea was my dad. And I said, wait a minute. How would you know Howard Shea? He said, well, don't you know? And I said, no, I don't. So he's my cousin. He was your cousin? Yeah. I said, well, wait a minute. Why don't I know about you? He said, don't you know? I said, no. He said, well, your grandfather committed suicide and left your grandmother, left Howard's mother with 8 children and didn't work and didn't have any money. So my mother talked to your dad's mother and said, Jesse, you can't keep those children. You should put them up for children's aid. And my grandmother said, don't you ever say that again. I never want to hear from you again. And the family split as a result. And through my life, talking hockey all the time with Dad, never ever once heard the name Jack McLean. I talked to the only surviving sibling of my dad's. He'd never heard the name Jack McLean. I talked to other people who are involved in the family, widows and things like that, and they'd never heard the name Jack McLean. So all of a sudden, the penny dropped, and I find out that, in fact, the reason that he was my dad's favorite player was because he was a relative. He was a cousin. And that's where the story really took off from there, Joe.
Yeah, that's phenomenal. I mean, you're not expecting to find that out about him, and but like it didn't. It was just. Was it because of the stigma around the suicide? Was it because
Right.
that you didn't hear about Jack McLean? Why wasn't why did your father sort of bury that story?
Well, Dad never knew, apparently. The story that I had heard through my entire life was that he lost his father in a farming accident. So
Mm,
whether that was the stigma, I mean, even to this day, suicide has a stigma, but not like it would have back in the 1930s and 40s. And so Dad, all his life, said, yeah, he, at the age of 6 years old, he lost his father in a farming accident in Meadowvale, just north of Toronto.
mhm.
And so that's what we accepted all along. And when I talked to these same people who I asked about Jack McLean, they said the same thing. Well, he died in a farm accident. Well, I guess in the broad strokes, you could say that he did, but the accident was suicide. And so I guess because Jack's mother had really pestered my dad's mother to give up the children, and it was so hurtful to my grandmother, and knowing that she didn't have any money, but she would get through it somehow. Some of the children were older, and they could contribute to the household. But I guess because of that, the family, there was fear, and the family split, and there it went. It just did never came up in the conversation. In fact, it wasn't until I got on ancestry.com, and that became a little bit more of a tool that we use for genealogy and things of that sort.
Mhm.
That in fact, I found his death certificate, and it did in fact prove what Jack had told me. His family had known but never brought it up and lived their life. But I was able to find it and find out that in fact he died from strychnine poisoning. So I can't even imagine what a horrid death that would have been.
Mm. And then
Yeah.
Jack actually showed up at your grandmother's house one day. Tell us about that meeting
Well,
between your
yeah,
dad
I thought that was
Jack.
the end of the McLean Shea relationship. But in fact, when he started with the Leafs, he was 19 years old. He's in 1942, 43. During that winter, he thought, you know what? I always liked Howard and my father's younger brother, Garnet, who's since passed as well. But I always liked Howard and Garnet. I might want to go and visit them. So he packed his duffel bag with his hockey equipment and went up to Meadowvale and knocked on my grandmother's door, my father's mother's door. This is getting complicated. And said, "Hi, Aunt Jessie. It's Jack McLean." Oh my God, I haven't seen you forever. And she welcomed him, and he said, "Well, listen, it's great. I wonder if Howard and Garnet are around." And she said, "Well, they're down on the Credit River playing shinny. Why don't you go and join them?" He said, "Well, I got my hockey equipment with me. I'm going to do exactly that." So he shimmied down the bank, and tied up his skates and skated out there. And when my dad saw him, he couldn't believe it. He hadn't seen him for a number of years, but he knew who it was immediately. And of course, they were choosing sides. And my dad says, "Oh, I've got Jack." He chose him immediately. And you could imagine that my dad and his brother were heroes amongst their neighborhood pals, because all of a sudden an NHL player is playing hockey with them. So, so Jack told me that story, and then he said, "You know what? The equipment was. I knew that your dad didn't have much money, and I didn't really want to carry the equipment back. So I said, listen, Howard, could you use this hockey equipment?" And my dad's eyes just lit up apparently, and said, "Are you kidding me?" So all of a sudden, he had a full set of equipment. He had elbow pads and shin pads and new skates and gloves. So, so I said, "Wait a minute, Jack, you left your hockey equipment with my father?" And he said, "Yeah." I said, "I've got my dad's equipment in the garage." He said, "Well, go look at it." It would say JM18, because that was the number I wore that season. So sure enough, as soon as our conversation was over, I went back to the garage and looked up, and there was nothing on the gloves that I could see, but they were pretty worn. But inside the shin pads, there was pencil, and it said JM18. I had Jack's hockey equipment. Unbelievable.
Wow. Wow.
Yeah.
Still there. That's crazy. And so you did a lot of research. You did a lot of tracking down. You end up meeting Jack finally. You talked to him on the phone, and then you got a chance to meet him in person. And what did you find out about Jack meeting him in person?
So I talked to him 4 years after after my first conversation with him. I continued to talk to him, and finally said, "Listen, Jack, would it be okay if I came up to visit you one time?" He said, "Well, I don't know that I've got many more stories to tell you, but if you feel you have to, please do." So, 1996, I make my plans with Jack, and I rent a hotel room, and I call him and tell him, "Listen, I'm going to come up now, Jack." And he said, "Red Lobster." So, what do you mean? Red Lobster. If you're coming up to talk to me, you're taking me for dinner. I said, okay, okay. I'd happily do that. So I drove up that day, and I didn't know what to expect because he'd been pretty gruff on the phone, although he was better as time went on. Anyway, I knock on the door at the appropriate time, and this little hunched over man shows up, and I would never, ever have recognized him from the photos that I had seen of Jack, the ones that you had shown earlier. Good looking young man, blonde, wavy
Hmm.
hair. Here's a man with a full head of hair, but it's white, white, white. And yeah, there we are. There's Jack right there, right in the middle. And hunched over from years and years of injuries and surgeries and things of that sort. And and we go in and we sit down, and he lights up a pipe, and we got talking. And through the subsequent visits, including that one, I found out all kinds of things about hockey in the during the Second World War, about the Toronto Maple Leafs of that era, and about my family as well. And it really forged a friendship that was unusual because Jack would have been approximately 80, I would have been about 40, and yet we became the best of friends as time went on. He was quite a character. I could always tell when he had had enough, and it was time to go to Red Lobster.
Hmm.
So every visit, I prepared accordingly, and off we went. But we became great friends through the years. Really, really strong friends.
And you learn more about his career and what he went through the time. And you also learned that, you know, playing in the NHL, playing for the Toronto Maple Leafs would be the dream of every young kid in Canada, just about. But it wasn't necessarily his number one priority, was it?
No, exactly, Joe. Funny how things work, and we all have our things that motivate us. Jack's mother was on her deathbed when he was approximately 10 years old, and he was very, very close with his mother, not so much with his father. And he was sitting on the edge of his bed, and on her bed rather. And she said, "Jack, you're a good student, and I want you someday to be an engineer." And that was in the back of his mind through his entire life. So even though he was a very, very good athlete and good enough to play in the National Hockey League, everybody else was dreaming about maybe playing in the National Hockey League one day, and specifically with the Toronto Maple Leafs because of Foster Hewitt and Hockey Night in Canada, but not for Jack. For Jack, it was a means to an end. By earning his salary playing with the Toronto Maple Leafs, it allowed him to pay for his education at the University of Toronto and get his university degree, his engineering degree. And so that was his motivating factor. And when he played in the NHL for the first time, I asked him the question. I said, "It had to be the thrill of your life, Jack." He said, "Well, it was great, but the thrill of my life was being able to accomplish something that I promised my mother I would do." And that really got me right in the heart. Boy, oh boy, just to think of that. But yeah, he played 3 years, and then in 1945, the war ended, thank goodness, and the boys started to come back, and they came back to play with the Maple Leafs, and there was no room on the team any longer for several players, including Jack McLean. So at the age of 22, his NHL career was over. He continued to play hockey at a pretty nice level too. He played senior hockey, which, just by way of explanation, At that time, it would have been just the rung below
Mm-hmm.
the National Hockey League, the Quebec Senior Hockey League, and things like that. They played for the Allen Cup and would get 15, 16,000 people jammed into the arena to watch their games. And so he played with the Ottawa Senators, not the NHL team, but the senior hockey team. He played with them for a couple of years and went to the Allen Cup final with them a couple of years as well. So his career continued on despite the fact he was no longer in the National Hockey League.
Well, in that time, and Conn Smythe was, pushing this as well. Like you had to satisfy certain military commitments to play for the Maple Leafs. At the same time, he's earning his degree in engineering, getting excellent grades, by the way. He's got a serious girlfriend, and he's playing professional hockey for the Maple Leafs and doing a pretty good job. I mean, an excellent job. I mean, he's getting significant, scoring stats, and he plays a rough and tumble game. He's not afraid to drop the mitts if he has to, and he's playing a tough game, and he's a significant factor in the Maple Leafs winning the 1945 Stanley Cup. But yet he's not quite really enamored by the way things are going with the Maple Leafs at that time.
Yeah, Joe, you're right. So he had been a top scorer on one of the top lines in his first season, playing with Gay Stewart and Bud Poyle. And Bud Poyle may be somewhat familiar to some people just from our conversation today. His son, David Poyle, was inducted into the Hockey Hall of Fame. So the line was really a fast skating, skilled line. But as time went on, those boys, both Stewart and Poyle, went off to serve their country. And he moved into a line that would be similar to an energy line, I guess I'll say.
Mm-hmm.
And as you said, he could drop the gloves. He was a great skater. He was a good checker, but he wasn't afraid to protect his teammates. And so he took that role on the last season of his career and had done very well. But he encountered a number of injuries through his career as well. And concussions were a recurring item for Jack. He'd had a bad back. He'd hurt his wrist, et cetera, et cetera. Anyway, the time comes along, and I say that the lineup was made, with Scotch tape and just masking tape or whatever, just to hold the team together.
Crazy.
But they went on. Yeah, exactly. They went on to win the Stanley Cup in 1945. He played a role in the semifinal with against the Montreal Canadiens, who were certainly the favored team that year. They had run away with the league and finished first. But Jack had contributed. He had been a checker. He made sure that the big boys didn't score. The Montreal Canadiens big boys, including Maurice Richard, didn't score as well. But during that season, or during that series rather, he was checked and he got a concussion. And it was pretty bad. The Leafs went on to play the Detroit Red Wings in the Stanley Cup final. Jack went down as well, but when he was there, he was woozy and talking to himself, and his roommate, whoever that was, I could never figure it out at that point, called the team doctor and called Hap Day, the coach, and said, "Jack's just not right now." And the doctor came and said, "Jack, you're going home." So they sent him home and sent him to the hospital. So Jack had to listen to the Stanley Cup final on the radio. And the Leafs went on. It was an amazing series, and I don't want to go into all the details, but Frank McCool, the goaltender, who was a rookie at that time, earned shutouts in the first 3 games of the series. It was crazy. And then Harry Lumley, the Detroit Red Wings goaltender, he came back and stood on his head from there, and it went to the 7th game, and the Leafs went on to win with Babe Bratt scoring the winning goal in overtime. So Jack is a Stanley Cup champion. The team wants to have a team picture with the Stanley Cup. Jack's in the hospital, but they let him out long enough to put on his equipment and stand in the picture. Even there he is in the second row on the far right side, right beside the trainer. And there he is. He's just come out of the hospital and he's put his equipment on so he can be in the team picture. And that's the last time he ever wore the Maple Leafs jersey. Or a sweater, I guess it would be at that time. So that's it. Jack McLean is a Stanley Cup champion, and they have a celebration, but it's not all good news for Jack. Sure, he's happy to be a Stanley Cup champion, but when they're dividing the spoils, the monetary spoils, Hap Day divvies up the money, and most of the players got $1,500, but Jack and a few other players were given $500. Jack didn't like that. So he sent a letter back to Hap Day saying, wait a minute, I gave my career for the Maple Leafs and I worked hard. And if it hadn't been for the injuries, I would have been there like all the other guys. And I don't think it's fair that I only got $500. So Hap Day called him into his office and it didn't get resolved. He got his $500. So he always had a little bit of bitterness towards the Maple Leafs at that point. Not only was his NHL career over, but he feels that he had earned the extra $1,000, which would have gone a long way at that particular time. It would have been 1945. So you can imagine that kind of money would have been quite substantial at that point. So Jack lost his love for the Leafs, although that was always his team through to the time that I met him as well. When I met him at the doorway, that for the first time, he had Maple Leaf slippers on and he had Maple Leaf things around the house. I think his family probably bought them for him, knowing that he was a Maple Leaf. But he didn't watch the games on TV. Oh, that's not hockey. It's just dump and shoot. What's that all about, Kevin? In his raspy voice. And anyway, he was quite a guy and told me a great deal about life and about family and certainly about the Maple Leafs.
And tell us about him getting his Stanley Cup ring finally.
Yeah. So just circumstances. There he is holding his ring. What a guy. He was so proud of that. Look at those eyes, his blue eyes. They had been crying when he received it. So the way that it went was Ken Dryden was president of the Toronto Maple Leafs at the time. And he wanted to draw the alumni a little bit closer. They had been estranged because of, going back to the Punch Imlach and Harold Ballard days. And so he decided he wanted to find out when the Maple Leafs started to give out Stanley Cup rings. And he wanted to find out players who had played with the Stanley Cup champion Leafs but had not received a ring. So Ken Dryden called his friend Ron Ellis, who was working at the Hockey Hall of Fame. They had played together on Team Canada in 1972. And Ken Dryden explained what he wanted. And Ron turned to me and said, you're the Maple Leafs historian. What do you think? I said, can you take it on? I said, I'd love to, for sure. So I did my research and I found out that the Leafs started to give rings in 1948. They had won the Stanley Cup in 1947, but there were no rings at that point. You got a choice of either a smoking set or a tea set, and you could have one or the other. But the rings were in 1948. And so I went back in 1932, 42, 45, and 47. All the players who were still with us who had won the Stanley Cup but had not received a ring. Now, if they were on the team in 45 or 47 and then went on to play in 48 and got a ring, they didn't qualify. So I found that there were 9 players. And I submitted the list to Ken Dryden and Ron Ellis. And Ken Dryden came back and said, well, I know 8 of these names, but who's this McLean guy? I said, well, Jack McLean. And I had to prove to him. So I showed him the engraving on the Stanley Cup. There's Jack McLean. And I showed him the newspaper clippings. And he said, well, he's earned it, so he gets one too. So they took Bill Barilko's ring from 1948, which at that point belonged to Ann Klisenich. Ann Klisenich was Bill Barilko's sister, and she had Bill's ring. And they fashioned the rings after the Barilko ring of 1948. So those 9 rings were made, and Ron Ellis came to me and said, listen, the Maple Leaf alumni are going to present the rings to the Stanley Cup champions who didn't get one, but I thought you might like to give the ring to Jack McLean. Kidding me? Of course I would. So I called him up and said, hey, Jack, I'd love to come up and see you sometime. And he said, oh, I would love that. That would be great. And I said, listen, I'm going to bring some friends. I hope you don't mind. He said, I hope they're pretty. Oh, Jack, okay, hang on here. Only Jack. And so I said, so can we come up on whatever date it happened to be? In fact, it was August 24th, 2002. There we go. So he said, that would be fine with me. So I told his daughter, Donna, that we were coming up. And I said, listen, I'm not bringing friends. I'm bringing the media. I've called the TV stations, the radio stations, the newspapers, and I've invited them, and they all want to be there for the ring presentation. And she had got Jack's ring size, so she knew what I was doing, but hadn't told him. So that was great. So she said, "That's great. I'll keep them in the lobby until you're ready. And when you tell me, I'll bring them up." So I got up to Jack's home. He was by this point living in a senior's residence, and and knocked on the door. And we had a bro hug. And hey, Jack, how's it going? Yeah, great. I thought you were bringing friends. I said, well, hang on, I'll get them. And in fact, Donna had them just outside the door. So I opened the door, and all of a sudden, TV cameras, mic flags, newspaper reporters come in, and hey, what's going on? What's going on here? And I said, Jack, I've got something I want to give to you. What's going on here? And I said, Jack, I've got a little box for you, little blue velvet box here. And I want to give this to you, and I think you'll really appreciate it. So what is this? And he opened it up, and here's this stoic man who, there we go, who all of a sudden the tears are running down his cheeks. Oh my God, I've wanted this my entire life. This is the best day of my life. And there it is, 1944, 45. It says the year on the left side, and on the right side, it's got his right side, rather, it's got his name, J. McLean. And I gave it to Jack, and he just was beyond belief. So it was on the TV that night. It was one of the lead stories. The next day, it was the opening story on the sports pages of the newspapers. And so Jack, all of a sudden, was a hero within his compound. He wanted to sit by himself because he didn't like small talk, but all the ladies all of a sudden wanted to sit at his table, and that made him very happy, Joe. And there he was. They had seen the story on TV, and he was getting people who wanted to stop by and see his Stanley Cup ring. There was a photo that you showed a little bit earlier of the entire family. We went to celebrate at the Keg that night, and there we are. His daughter Donna is on the left side. His grandson is on the right side. That's Ryan. I'm in the back behind, and Donna's partner John is behind. And we went to the Keg to celebrate that night. That was a real treat for Jack, because I don't think he'd had steak in several years. But anyway, we went, and I don't know whether he told the people there or whether Donna, his daughter, said it, but the manager came over and said, look, we've never had a Stanley Cup champion here before. Your dinner is on the house. So I don't know whether it was the great steak that he had or whether it was because he got a free meal, but Jack was on top of the world at that point, and there we go. So that was the giving of the ring, and a very special day in Jack's life, and certainly in mine, to be able to give it to him.
Wow, that's a beautiful story. So I mean, so we got the Jack and the box, the box your dad made in grade 8 shop class. I think we made coat hangers in grade 8 shop class. Then you got Jack and the box, giving him the ring, right? But there's a third Jack in the box that came in the mail. Tell us about that story.
Yeah, thanks, Joe. Yeah, years had gone by, and I had not forgotten Jack by any means. He was an important part of my life, and I missed him very much. I kept in touch, especially with his daughter, and just exchanging phone calls and Christmas cards and things of that ilk. And then out of the blue, 2000, I don't know, I think it was 2005, several years later anyway, and my wife called me up and said, oh, you got a courier today? And that wasn't unusual. So I said, I'll get it when I get home, honey. And got home, and we watched Jeopardy. And then I thought, oh, wait a minute, I got a package. I better check it out. No, I mean, there was an address on it, but it didn't mean anything to me. But I opened it up, and it was quite amazing. There was a little blue box one more time, and a letter that went with it. And if you don't mind if I read it, dear Kevin,
please do.
You made our father very happy during the final years of his life. We decided as a family that you should have Dad's Stanley Cup ring. No one deserved it more than you. Sincerely, John, Donna, and Bruce McLean, Jack's children. And so to this day, I very, very proudly wear Jack's Stanley Cup ring. It's hard for me to get the center. Hang on, there we go.
Yeah. Other side, yeah.
Whatever.
Yeah, good.
Anyway, I wear Jack's ring with great pride. I treasure it. To think that they gave me something so precious that had belonged to their father means the world to me. And there we go. So when I told them I was writing a book, I didn't know how that was going to go over. And they were thrilled. And they've read the book and are so happy. And you told us things about our father that we didn't even know ourselves. And oh my goodness, the work that you put into that. And it was really, really very fun to do, Joe. And I'm just so pleased that after all these years, I finally chose to write the story. So there we go.